Hi guys, thanks for joining us today. Now, talking about furlough today, we've got Louise and Sarah. Louise, a virtual hub, HR expert, and Sarah, HR lawyer. So we should have all the bases covered, and really trying to get our head around furlough and what furlough is and where we are with its implementation. So Sheetal and I got loads of questions, and we're getting loads of questions from people we know about this. And starting, what is furlough? What does it mean to furlough somebody?
But it's part of a package of support for businesses that the Chancellor announced back in last week or the week before, and I think it's been flying around quite a bit, but it's a scheme that's intended to support employers to continue paying employees who would otherwise be made redundant or be laid off. So the heart of the scheme is about preventing those perhaps sort of and pushing them off into the future. It's open to all employers with a PAYE scheme, including public sector and charities as well. So under the scheme, if an employee is furloughed, classed as a furloughed worker, a grant will be available from HMRC, which will reimburse the employer for either 80% of their wage costs each month, or £2,500 as a maximum, or up to £2,500 as a maximum. It can be backdated to the 1st of March. Whether or not that's actually, likely is another matter, and I'm sure we'll discuss that. And one of the key things about this furlough scheme is that the employee cannot do any work that would result in any profit for the employer. So it's kind of like putting the worker out to pasture. That's a phrase that I've heard quite a bit. What would you add to that, Sarah?
Yeah, I would just say where you said 80% of wage costs, just that there's been some confusion as to what's included in that and what isn't included. So that 80% is really the gross basic salary. It doesn't include any fees or commissions or anything like that. And then on top of that, so if you reach the £2,500 cap, on top of that, HMRC will also reimburse for employers' national insurance contributions and any pension auto-enrolment contributions.
Okay, so that, I mean, that sounds really quite generous, right? So the purpose of it is to say, look, don't make a knee-jerk reaction. You can put your staff on furlough. Essentially, it's from the date that you sent them home due to the COVID-19 outbreak, or it's directly affected that as far back as the 1st of March. So I'm guessing for most employers, it would have been when Boris stood up and said people shouldn't be going to work.
There's going to be very few employers or employees who are furloughed right back to the 1st of March, because there aren't going to have been many employers that closed and sent their employees home such that they weren't doing any work for that employer from the 1st of March, given that the announcement hadn't even been made by that point. So I think in reality, we're not going to see many furloughed employees backdated to the 1st of March.
It's okay, it's 20th of March. Government said you got to furlough someone. What does that mean for the business? What do they do?
So importantly, to enable to put somebody on furlough, you're going to need to agree it with them. It's not just a unilateral decision. An employer can't just turn around and say, you're all furloughed, off you go, you're only getting 80% of your salary. Because like as with all terms and conditions of employment, you can only vary those terms and conditions with the consent of both parties. And so importantly, we are advising all of our clients to make sure that they put in place a written agreement. And in fact, that's part of the government advice, that any agreement is in writing. Just to confirm when they're going to be on furlough leave, from when and until when. And the end date, I think, is quite tricky to ascertain at the moment, because currently it's there for up to 3 months, but can be extended. And also there's a minimum requirement of 3 weeks for furlough leave.
It's up to 3 months from 1st of March.
Exactly. So up until the 31st of May at the moment, with the possibility of that being extended. That furlough agreement is also going to need in it all the details as to what they're being paid, when they're being paid it, and an agreement as to any reduction in salary. And I say any reduction in salary, and that's because their employer is entitled to uplift the reduction to pay them 100%. They don't have to reduce their salary. They're only being reimbursed 80% of their salary, or the £2,500 maximum, by HMRC. But if they wanted to continue paying furloughed employees 100% of their salary, they're perfectly entitled to do that.
Does the employer have to pay them now and then recover it back from the government at a later date? How's that working?
That's one of the challenges that a lot of my clients are talking about, because the scheme, which we think will be a portal scheme through HMRC for employers to go in, load up this information and claim for a reimbursement of the 80%, we think and hope will be up and running by the end of April. Until then, employers are going to have to fund this 80%, or if they're going to be able to pay 100%, they're funding that salary bill.
One way around having to pay everybody and fund it up until the point that they're reimbursed by HMRC is potentially including an agreement from the employee within that furlough agreement that they're signing to deferring any payments of salary up until the point that the employer is reimbursed under the scheme, which would essentially mean they don't get anything between now or between the date that they started their furlough leave until the date that their employer is reimbursed. And not many people are going to be very happy about that. But if the alternative to signing that agreement is being made redundant or being laid off on unpaid leave, then it might be something that they're happy to agree to.
The reality is it might be absolutely necessary. You know, a lot of businesses, and as you know, Sheetal, especially, you know, they don't run at huge profit margins every month. You know, if they've lost trade for the last
cash flow,
they're under huge pressure. They might not be able to do so. And in reality, is the government scheme it's more about the government scheme being launched and not being ready. You know, it's a long time, and they're not advancing it quick enough. So
which goes, absolutely, and it goes back to that point about the at the beginning you were saying about furloughing people and that agreement, because we expect the portal to be in place, the government portal, but we don't know what's going into that government portal. And it could be that all the evidence needs to go into that. It could be, I'm just presuming they might need to know the agreement of the actual date. So they might need the evidence of the furlough agreement, the software, businesses have to run their payroll for March. It's got to be done in the next few days. And it's the year end as well. And they're going to submit all the forms. The likelihood of the software companies going back and changing their software for the payroll is non-existent, because you're going to have to do all these RTIs right now. So it will be the business owner getting that data, put it onto the government portal. So it's really important that the business owner gets his documentation, all the data, all the agreements and everything in place. Because it's like going for the CBIL loan. If it's not in place, it's going to take longer for the portal to process it.
One additional complication to that is that any employees that have been made redundant since the 28th of February and going forwards are entitled to be rehired by their employers now and then placed on furlough leave. If the reason for their redundancy was the fact that the business just wasn't able to continue trading during the current crisis. So then there's an added complication with the payroll. If somebody has received a redundancy payment, their payment in lieu of notice perhaps, and then suddenly we need to reclaim all of that back, but put them onto furlough, cut their salary by 80%. I'm glad I'm not a payroll expert.
And so let's say you've now got an agreement in place, which really what we're saying is you need to get advice on that. There's some sophistication there. What you mentioned, the sorts of things in the agreement will be when the furlough date, when you were put on furlough, when it commences, how we're proposing to deal with the entitlement. So how much you're entitled to under the scheme, and then how much, if any, you're going to pay them over and above. What else does it cover? I mean, you said it's up to 3 months, but if someone's on furlough, can you just call them back straight away when you need them? Is that something that's dealt with in the agreement, or anything else that you would really consider?
So we'd expect to see in there some kind of notice provision to confirm exactly how much notice the employer needs to provide to end the furlough, or how the furlough leave will end and why. So if the employer is no longer eligible to reclaim money under the scheme, or if the scheme ends by government, then that those are perhaps two reasons why an employee would then immediately end their furlough leave. And I've seen anything from 1 day's notice to 1 week's notice. I mean, you could put in there what you want. It, after all, is an agreement between the parties. But in reality and in a practical sense, an employer is going to want to bring their employees back into the company and to work almost as soon as that scheme ends. So I would say 1 day's notice is perfectly sufficient.
And when someone's on furlough, okay, I mean, that's really useful again, because there's a practical. So when they're on furlough, Louise, you mentioned earlier that they're not supposed to be working, but you mentioned something about not doing any profitable work. I mean, what defines working and not working? Because we all are connected by email. You might be picking up, information that's happening in a business. Is that working? And does that maybe put the furlough payment at risk?
That's really important.
well
Sorry,
do.
because especially for small companies and company directors, because for small companies with a few employees, that's a bit difficult.
It would be interesting to see your view on this, Sarah, but I think I would err on the side of caution and be seeking to try and demonstrate that no work had been carried out, that no work should be done unless it's voluntary work, which I think a lot of people have been doing outside of the context of their normal work. So perhaps volunteering, obviously for the NHS, which is, been really popular, but other types of work. And there's a discussion around whether work can be done for other employers and not the employer that has furloughed you, which we think is acceptable, don't we, Sarah?
Yeah, so the government guidance does stipulate that furloughed employees cannot work for the employer that has furloughed them. And then it goes on to say that they can carry out volunteer work and they can do training relevant to their role, provided that they're still being paid national minimum wage for that training. What it doesn't say is that you can't go and work for another employer. Now, obviously, in the contract of employment that would still be in existence, even though you're currently on furlough leave, all of the terms of that remain the same except with the remuneration terms. There could be a clause in that contract which prevents you from working for another company whilst you're still employed by your current employer. Now, if that's the case, then you would be precluded from working elsewhere. If your contract of employment doesn't have that provision, there's nothing in my understanding that prevents you from going to Tesco, for example, and seeing whether they need any extra cashiers.
And on what happened when the announcement was made and you're looking to furlough and you were already self-isolating?
At the moment, the current guidance is if you're self-isolating, whether that be because you're showing symptoms or members of your household are showing symptoms, then you are entitled to be receiving statutory sick pay during that time. Anyone in receipt of statutory sick pay cannot be furloughed. So technically, they need to have seen out their isolation and stopped receiving statutory sick pay before their employer can then put them on furlough leave.
So that's clearly an oversight in a sense, because statutory sick is currently £90 a week? Or...
Yeah, £94-ish.
Yeah, when this is up to a maximum of £2,500 a month, right? And you've just talked earlier about a provision where if you've made people redundant because of fears surrounding that, you can actually hire them back. So this seems a bit, this seems to potentially open up people that are going to be financially in distress coming into work when they should be self-isolating, or some sort. It doesn't seem appropriate when they're actually doing the right thing.
I think
protecting their employees.
We'll certainly see a reduction in the figures of people who are self-isolating, but in a practical sense, they're going to be at home anyway. The guidance is you're not allowed to leave your home unless absolutely necessary. So it's not that they would be coming into work. I imagine as soon as that self-isolation period ends, they're then furloughed, and there's no. They're not cutting isolation short, as it were.
Okay, and I suppose also if they've been self-isolating for the last week, but they've been at home for 2.5 weeks, you probably would not recognise the statutory sick, and you'd say we'll furlough you back to that relevant point.
Absolutely.
And you're on furlough. Yeah.
Say you've got members of staff that are on higher salaries, who are a service firm, a consultancy, law firm, and they're on £50,000-60,000 a year. So when they go on furlough, their salary gets reduced to 2,500, or you've got to make the difference between that and the 80%?
So their salary would be reduced to £2,500 per month. So for them, quite a significant a drop in salary.
True, and it doesn't accrue. So let's say they're on furlough for 3 weeks. If you calculated the short, that obligation is just lost. They've essentially agreed to a reduction in relation to their employment contract in their salary for that period of time.
I mentioned before, this mainly came about because of the hospitality industry. Now, in that industry, people are not on fixed hours or fixed. They're not on fixed hours. So how would you know how much to pay them going forward?
So there are provisions in the guidance for how to calculate people who are on a variable pay. And Louise, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that is that they are put on 80% of their average salary for the whole of the last financial year, or they are put on whatever their salary was in the month in the preceding year, which matches this month. So say you're looking at April, they would look at April 2019. And then whichever is the higher, I think they can choose whichever is the higher to choose that option.
So say we come out of this, or well, we don't know when we're going to come out, and it turns out in a new business environment that your business isn't viable anymore. Yeah, do we straight away go on to redundancy? And what happens with the people that have been on furlough?
Yeah, so redundancy, I imagine there will be a fair few redundancies coming out of furlough, because it's just in a practical sense, not all businesses are going to be straight back up and running at the level they were before this all happened, unfortunately. What I would say is that tribunals will want to see that the usual employment laws surrounding unfair dismissal and redundancy consultation processes are complied with. So full consultation processes still need to happen with any potentially redundant employees. And they will be entitled on their redundancy to a statutory redundancy payment, and either a payment in lieu of notice, or they'll be required to work their notice.
Well, so I think this has been really useful. I'm really grateful to you both for coming in and trying to explain to Sheetal and I actually the scheme and some of the useful tips and the practicalities to consider. So I think that's really, really helpful to me, and I'll certainly take it on board when I'm passing that information to others as well. So thank you both.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you very much as well. I've learned